In the autumn of 1717, as the first killing frosts bled the color from the high ridges of the Appalachians, a storm of unusual violence descended upon the mountains. It was a tempest born of ice and wind, a physical manifestation of the region's deep and abiding loneliness. Within this maelstrom, a small party of men, driven by a duty that had long since curdled into grim resignation, found a cabin tucked into a fold of the ancient rock. It was a discovery that would become a quiet, unhealed wound in the memory of the territory, a place where a profound silence had taken root and grown into something monstrous. They found the door barred from the inside. If the lost histories of forgotten places whisper to you, and this is your first time in our archives, consider subscribing. Become a keeper of the stories that the shadows would prefer to conceal. The search party had been tracking for 3 days, their progress a slow, brutal crawl against the onslaught of the elements. They were not adventurers, but settlers, men whose lives were etched into a repeating pattern of hardship and endurance. There was the lead tracker, a man whose face was a roadmap of windburn and squint lines, his movements economical and certain. With him were 2 others, a younger man, barely out of his teens, whose initial resolve had been scoured away by the relentless cold, leaving a raw and visible fear in its place, and a grim-faced elder, a man who had buried more than one child in the unforgiving mountain soil and had little patience for mysteries that did not involve survival. Their search was for a father and his daughter, new arrivals who had pushed deeper into the wilderness than any had before, chasing the promise of untamed land. The father had been seen in the valley weeks prior, trading pelts for salt and iron, and had spoken of his daughter, a young woman of 21 years, who kept their new homestead. He had promised to return to the settlement before the first snow. The snow had come, and then the storm, and he had not. The mountain, which the local Cherokee called the Ridge of Weeping Spirits and the settlers had bluntly renamed Blood Ridge, did not suffer trespassers gladly. It was a labyrinth of granite escarpments, dense rhododendron thickets that tore at clothing and flesh, and hollows so deep they never saw the full light of day. The wind, a constant, keening presence, was the mountain's own voice, and it spoke a language of profound indifference. It howled through the skeletal branches of chestnut and oak, carrying with it the frozen scent of pine and wet earth. For the search party, every gust felt like a physical blow, a reminder of their own insignificance in this vast, vertical world. The horses, heads bowed against the sleet, trembled with exhaustion, their breath pluming in the frigid air like fleeting ghosts. The lead tracker, who had spent his life learning to read the subtle language of the forest, found the landscape unnervingly quiet. The usual signs of life, the tracks of deer or the chatter of squirrels, were absent. It was as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting. They found the cabin not by sight, but by smell. A faint, almost imperceptible trace of wood smoke, long dead and cold, caught on the wind. It was enough. The lead tracker altered their course, guiding them down a treacherous slope of slick, moss-covered stone and into a small, protected clearing. The cabin was almost perfectly camouflaged, its rough-hewn log walls the same shade of gray as the surrounding rock, its roof a thick blanket of sod and wind-blasted moss. It seemed less a construction and more an organic growth, something the mountain had permitted to exist for a time. An unnatural stillness surrounded it, a pocket of silence in the heart of the storm. The wind, which had been their constant tormentor, seemed to veer around the clearing, its roar softening to a distant, mournful sigh. The snow, which fell thick and heavy elsewhere, drifted down here in lazy, almost contemplative spirals. The structure was small, barely a single room, with a fieldstone chimney that stood like a crooked tombstone against the bruised twilight sky. There were no windows on the side facing them, only a single, heavy plank door. The men dismounted, their movements stiff and slow. The cold had settled deep into their bones, a lethargy that was difficult to fight. The younger man fumbled with the reins of his horse, his gaze fixed on the cabin door. He confessed later that he had felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, a feeling he could only describe as being watched by something old and patient. The grim-faced elder simply spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the snow, his eyes narrowed, calculating the structural integrity of the cabin, weighing it as a potential shelter against the coming night. He noted the careful chinking between the logs, the solid set of the chimney. It was good work, the work of someone who intended to stay. The lead tracker, however, was focused on the details that were wrong. There were no footprints leading to or from the cabin, save for their own. The snow lay in a smooth, undisturbed blanket. The woodpile, neatly stacked against the far wall, was covered in a thick layer of ice, suggesting it had not been touched in a very long time. There was no warmth radiating from the chimney, no light from within. He circled the small structure, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. He found a single, small window on the back wall, its opening covered not with glass, but with a stretched and oiled piece of animal hide, scraped thin to admit a pale, milky light. It was intact. He returned to the front of the cabin and gestured for the elder. Together, they examined the door. It was solid oak, pitted and weathered, with a simple wooden latch. The lead tracker called out, his voice sounding thin and shockingly loud in the oppressive quiet. There was no reply. He called again, louder this time. His voice sharpened with an authority that belied his own growing unease. The only answer was the faint creak of a branch somewhere overhead, heavy with ice. He tried the latch. It was solid. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed, the muscles in his back and legs straining. The wood did not yield. The grim-faced elder joined him, and together, the two men threw their combined weight against the door. A deep groaning sound came from within, the sound of a heavy wooden bar resisting their efforts. The cabin was not just closed, it was barred from the inside. This was a critical, anomalous detail. Why would someone bar the door and then vanish? Or, a more chilling question began to form in the back of their minds. Had they not vanished at all? With a final, coordinated heave, a sharp crack echoed through the clearing. The wood of the door jamb splintered, and the door swung inward with a protesting shriek of its leather hinges, revealing a square of profound and impenetrable darkness. For a long moment, the three men stood at the threshold, peering into the gloom. The air that flowed out of the cabin was colder than the storm outside, a dead, stagnant cold that carried the scent of dust, dried herbs, and something else, something vaguely organic and unsettlingly sweet. The lead tracker struck a flint and steel, the sparks showering into the darkness, and lit the wick of a small tallow lamp. He held it aloft, the flickering, greasy light pushing back the shadows inch by inch, revealing the secrets of the small, solitary room. The interior was immaculate, unnaturally so. It was a space defined by a meticulous, almost desperate order. To the left stood a narrow cot, its straw-filled mattress covered by a neatly folded patchwork quilt. At the foot of the cot was a small wooden chest, its lid closed. To the right, a stone hearth dominated the wall, swept clean of all but the faintest layer of gray ash. A single iron pot, scrubbed and dry, hung from a hook inside. Along the back wall, rough shelves had been built between the logs. On these shelves were dozens of small bundles of dried herbs, tied with twine and arranged by size and type. Below them, a small, hand-carved table stood with a single stool tucked beneath it. On the table sat a wooden bowl, a spoon, and a tin cup, all perfectly clean, as if awaiting a meal that was never served. The floor, made of wide, hand-hewn planks, had been swept so thoroughly that the grain of the wood was visible even in the dim light. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, a portrait of a life lived with care and precision, but it was a life that was conspicuously, terrifyingly absent. The silence inside was different from the silence of the clearing. It was a heavy, weighted silence, the silence of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. As their eyes adjusted to the weak, trembling light of the lamp, the men began to notice other, more disturbing details. Scraps of thread, in shades of blue and gray and faded calico, littered the floor around the stool, a stark contrast to the otherwise pristine condition of the cabin. On the cot, tucked against the wall, they saw small pieces of torn fabric, remnants of what looked to have been a dress or an apron, the edges ragged and frayed. It appeared as though someone had been systematically tearing apart their own clothing. The lead tracker moved deeper into the room, his lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and recoil from the light. He ran a hand over the surface of the small table. It was free of dust. He peered into the iron pot hanging in the hearth. It was empty. The entire space felt preserved, like an exhibit sealed behind glass, untouched by the passage of time. He turned his attention to the cot and the small chest at its foot. The younger man and the elder remained near the doorway, their reluctance to enter the space palpable. They were simple men, accustomed to the straightforward brutality of nature, but this was something else. This was a human mystery, and it felt fundamentally wrong. The cabin was not a home. It was a testament. But to what? The lead tracker knelt by the cot, holding the lamp closer. It was then that he saw them. At first, he did not understand what he was looking at. Arranged in a neat semicircle on the floor, facing the empty stool at the table, were a half-dozen small, man-like figures. They were dolls, crudely fashioned from scraps of the same fabric he had seen on the cot. Their bodies were simple bundles of cloth, tied with thread. Their limbs were twisted rags. Their heads were balls of bunched-up linen, and for faces, they had small, dark buttons, polished smooth by time or touch, sewn into place as eyes. They were silent, motionless, their button eyes seeming to absorb the lamplight without reflecting it. They were positioned as if they were an audience or a jury, waiting for a speaker who would never arrive. One doll was larger than the others, made from a coarse, dark wool that might have been a man's coat. Another was smaller, fashioned from a delicate, faded floral print, perhaps from a woman's apron. Each one was distinct, a crude effigy of a person, and they were all made from the same limited palette of fabrics found within the cabin, fabrics that had clearly been torn from the garments of its lone inhabitant. The young woman had, it seemed, dismantled her own wardrobe to create her silent, watchful companions. A cold dread, far deeper and more penetrating than the chill of the storm, began to settle over the lead tracker. He had seen death in many forms, the aftermath of animal attacks, the ravages of starvation, the quiet surrender to winter. He understood the logic of survival and the finality of its failure. But this scene defied all logic. It was a tableau of profound and unsettling madness. This was not the work of a person preparing for winter or awaiting the return of a loved one. This was the work of a mind that had been left alone with itself for too long, a mind that had begun to fray and unravel in the suffocating silence. He could feel the immense weight of the solitude that had filled this room, an isolation so complete that it had bent reality itself. The dolls were not toys. They were a desperate, last-ditch defense against the encroaching emptiness, a silent chorus created to fill a void that had become unbearable. They were her company. He rose slowly, his gaze sweeping over the small, still figures. The cabin, which had at first seemed a place of order, now felt like a meticulously constructed stage for a play of singular, internal horror. His gaze fell upon the largest of the dolls, the one made from the dark wool. It was positioned slightly in front of the others, as if in a place of honor. Tucked just under its leg, almost completely hidden, was a small, folded piece of paper. He reached down, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before closing around it. The paper was brittle, and the corner crumbled slightly at his touch. He carefully unfolded it. It was a page torn from a journal or a ledger, the paper yellowed and stained with what might have been water, or perhaps tears. Written on the page, in a delicate, looping script that spoke of a gentle upbringing far from these wild mountains, were a few short, faded lines of ink. The words were a simple prayer, a plea for a safe return. But it was the signature at the bottom that made the lead tracker's blood run cold, for it gave a name to the ghost that haunted this small, silent room. The signature was neat, precise, and heartbreakingly clear. It read, Eliza H. Here, at last, was the first piece of the puzzle. The first tangible clue to the identity of the girl of Bloodridge. The discovery of her name, her own writing, did not solve the mystery. It only deepened it, opening a dark doorway into the story of her solitude and the slow, terrible descent that had followed. The journal of Eliza Harrow, pieced together from the fragile, water-stained pages found within the cabin, begins not with fear, but with a resolute and almost defiant hope. It is a document that allows us to step back in time, to see Bloodridge not through the eyes of the grim search party, but through the eyes of a young woman who saw in its vast, untamed wilderness the promise of a new beginning. To understand what happened within those four silent walls, we must first understand how she came to be there, and how a place intended as a sanctuary became her tomb. The story of Eliza Harrow's descent is not a sudden plunge into madness, but a slow, methodical erosion of the self. A process that began in the late summer of 1717 under a sky as bright and clear as her own aspirations. She had arrived with her father, a man named Elias Harrow, in the month of August. He was a widower, a carpenter by trade, a man whose hands were as comfortable with an axe as they were with a wood plane. He was fleeing the coastal settlements to the east, places where a virulent fever had swept through the crowded, unsanitary towns, taking with it his wife and his youngest son. The loss had hollowed him out, leaving behind a quiet, grim determination to build a life where such plagues could not reach them, a life buffered by the clean, sharp air of the mountains. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, and in the sheer, brutal geography of the Appalachians, he saw not a threat, but a fortress. Eliza, at 21 years of age, shared his resilience, though hers was tempered with a softer, more reflective nature. Her journal's early entries describe the journey westward in painstaking detail, noting the species of wildflowers she saw growing along the trading paths and the changing character of the forest as they ascended into the higher elevations. There is a sense of wonder in her early writing, the perspective of someone who saw the world not as a thing to be conquered, but as a text to be read. They chose their spot with care, a small, level clearing protected from the worst of the northern winds by a high granite cliff face. A freshwater spring bubbled up from the rocks nearby, its water so cold it made the teeth ache. For weeks, the valley echoed with the rhythmic, percussive sounds of their labor. The sharp bite of the axe into virgin timber, the rasp of the crosscut saw, the solid thud of log meeting log. Together, they raised the cabin, a testament to their shared purpose. Her father, with his encyclopedic knowledge of woodcraft, notched the logs with a precision that left no gaps, creating walls that were nearly seamless. Eliza, in the meantime, gathered stones for the hearth and chimney, her hands growing calloused and strong. She learned to mix a daub of clay, moss, and hog hair to chink the walls, making them impervious to the wind. In those early weeks, the cabin was a place of sweat and effort, of shared meals by a crackling fire under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed almost close enough to touch. The silence of the mountains was, at that time, a peaceful presence, a welcome respite from the cacophony of the towns they had left behind. Her journal from this period is filled with simple, declarative statements of progress. A typical entry from late August reads that her father had set the main roof beam, and that she had successfully gathered enough late-season berries to preserve. There is a palpable sense of pride in these words, the satisfaction of a life being built by their own hands. In mid-September, with the cabin complete and a respectable woodpile stacked high against the wall, her father announced that he must make one last journey down to the valley settlement before the weather turned. They were well stocked with dried meat and flour, but they needed salt, iron for tools, and perhaps a few small luxuries to see them through their first winter. He was a man of few words, and his farewell was characteristically understated. He told her to keep the fire banked, to stay close to the cabin, and that he would return in no more than 3 weeks, well before the first snows were due. He had made this journey before and saw no particular danger in it. Eliza, standing in the doorway of the home they had built together, felt a flicker of apprehension, a sudden awareness of her own smallness in the face of the vast, indifferent wilderness. The forest that had seemed so beautiful and full of life now felt overwhelmingly large, its shadows deeper than she had remembered. He assured her he would travel quickly. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of physical affection, and told her she was strong enough to manage on her own for a short while. Then he mounted his horse, gave a final nod, and rode out of the clearing, disappearing into the dense tapestry of green and gold. Eliza watched him go, staying in the doorway until the faint sound of his horse's hooves had been completely swallowed by the immense silence of the forest. Then she turned, went back inside, and barred the door. For the first week, her solitude was a novelty, a welcome quiet after the relentless work of the preceding month. She established a routine, a rhythm of domestic tasks that gave structure to her days. She tended the small garden, gathered firewood, and spent her evenings by the fire, mending clothes and writing in her journal. The entries from this period are calm, orderly, and filled with observations about her surroundings. She describes the way the sunlight filtered through the oiled hide of the window, casting a warm amber glow across the room. She writes of a family of deer that came to drink at the spring each morning, their movements graceful and silent. The cabin was her sanctuary, a snug and secure shell against the world. At night, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant call of an owl. She was alone, but she was not yet lonely. She measured the passing days by scratching marks into one of the logs near the hearth, a neat row of 7 lines, then another. The end of the 3rd week approached, the time her father had promised for his return. It was on the 21st day that the first real seed of anxiety was planted. She spent the entire day listening, her ears straining to catch the sound of a horse on the trail. She found herself wandering to the edge of the clearing, peering down the path he had taken, seeing nothing but the shifting leaves. The sun set, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, and still he did not come. Her journal entry for that night is shorter than usual. It simply notes that her father was delayed. The next day, she repeated her vigil, and the next. The methodical calm of her writing begins to show the first hairline fractures. She starts to write about him in the past tense, recalling conversations they had, then correcting herself mid-sentence. Hope remained, but it was now a conscious act of will, something that had to be maintained rather than something that came naturally. She began to fill the silence with her own voice, narrating her actions as she performed them. She would say aloud that now she was fetching water, now she was kneading bread. The sound of her own voice was a comfort, a proof of her own existence in the overwhelming quiet. But the echo that came back from the log walls was thin and hollow, a poor substitute for a human reply. A month passed, and then another. The vibrant colors of autumn leached from the landscape, leaving behind a stark and skeletal world of gray and brown. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. The wind developed a new voice, a mournful, high-pitched keen that seemed to work its way through the tiniest cracks in the cabin walls. The mountain was no longer a place of beauty. It was a vast, empty chamber that amplified her isolation. At what point does solitude cease to be a state of being and become an active presence? For Eliza, that transformation began when the silence started to feel like it was listening. She would find herself stopping mid-task, certain she had heard a noise, a footstep outside, the creak of a floorboard behind her. But there was never anything there. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of the cabin, and within that space, her own mind was becoming an increasingly unreliable companion. The first snow fell in late October. It was not the blizzard that the search party would later encounter, but a gentle, almost apologetic dusting of white that coated the world in a blanket of pristine silence. For Eliza, it was a devastating blow. The snow was a physical barrier, a definitive end to the possibility of her father's easy return. The trail to the valley would be impassable now until the spring thaw. She was trapped. Her journal entry on that day is a single, spidery sentence. She wrote that the snow had come, and that she was now truly alone. The orderly catalog of her days gives way to a more fragmented, desperate kind of writing. The neat rows of scratches on the log by the hearth are abandoned. Time was no longer a thing to be measured in days, but in an endless, undifferentiated stretch of waiting. Her hope, which had been a bright, steady flame, began to gutter and fail, and as it did, her mind began to construct its own reality to fill the void. The memories of her family, once a source of comfort, became vivid, almost tangible presences in the room. She started writing letters, not in her journal, but on scraps of paper, on the backs of old almanac pages, on anything she could find. They were long, rambling letters addressed to her father, filled with questions she knew he could not answer. She asked him if he was safe, if he was warm, if he remembered the promise he had made. She would leave the letters on the table overnight, and in the morning she would read them again. And it was in this ritual that the final, critical fracture occurred. She began to hear his replies. They were not audible sounds, not at first. They were thoughts, answers that seemed to bloom in her mind with such clarity and force that they did not feel like her own. She would read a question she had written, and the answer would arrive, fully formed, in her father's voice, but inside her own head. He told her not to worry. He told her he was delayed by the weather, that he was safe. She recorded these conversations in her journal as if they were real. Her handwriting, once so uniform, began to shift subtly when she recorded his side of the dialogue. It was a small change, a slight alteration in the slant of the letters, but it was a clear, forensic indicator of a consciousness beginning to divide against itself. The loneliness had become so absolute that her mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, had begun to populate the emptiness. The voices were a comfort, a shield against the crushing silence. But they were not enough. A voice needs a body. A presence needs a form. and with the long, dark months of winter stretching out before her, Eliza Harrow began to look at her own clothing, at the needle and thread in her sewing kit, and conceived of a way to give her new companions a physical home. The human mind, when faced with absolute isolation, does not simply endure the silence, it actively fights against it. It will build bulwarks, construct companions, and if necessary, it will sacrifice reality itself to keep the void at bay. For Eliza Harrow, sealed within her snowbound cabin on Blood Ridge, the disembodied voices that whispered in the echo chamber of her own thoughts were a temporary solace, but they were ultimately insufficient. They were ghosts, formless and fleeting. What she craved was not just a voice, but a presence. She needed weight, texture, and a gaze that could meet her own across the flickering candlelight. The imagination, once it has taken root, demands a physical form. And so, with the methodical desperation of a castaway weaving a rope from their own hair, Eliza began the work of creating a family from the remnants of her former life. Her first creation was born from an act of profound and symbolic sacrifice. Tucked away in the small wooden chest at the foot of her cot was a work shirt belonging to her father. It was a coarse, homespun garment of dark wool, patched at the elbows, and it still carried his faint, residual scent of sawdust and pine smoke. For weeks, she had taken it out at night, holding it to her face, a pathetic and dwindling communion with the man she was certain she would never see again. Now, she laid it out on the table, the lamplight giving its worn fabric a soft, almost living texture. Taking her sewing shears, a tool meant for mending, she made the first cut. The sound of the blades parting the thick wool was shockingly loud in the silent room, a sound of irreversible decision. She did not weep. Her actions were precise, almost clinical, as if she were following a set of instructions only she could perceive. She cut the shirt into rudimentary shapes: a torso, 2 arms, 2 legs. Her fingers, nimble from years of needlework, flew as she stitched the pieces together, her stitches small and tight. For stuffing, she used dried grass she pulled from the chinking in the walls, mixing it with scraps from her own worn-out undergarments, a strange and intimate fusion of his essence and hers. The body was a simple, limbless sack, but it had a certain heft, a satisfying weight in her hands. Now, it needed a face. She rummaged through her small sewing kit and found 2 buttons of polished black jet, spared from a dress she had long since outgrown. They were dark, smooth, and cool to the touch. With a new length of thread, she affixed them to the head, pulling the thread tight so that the fabric puckered slightly around them, creating the illusion of deep-set sockets. The moment the second button was in place, the object on the table was transformed. It was no longer a bundle of rags. It was a figure. It was watching her. She propped it up against the wall, and in her journal that night, she recorded a new kind of entry. She did not write that she had made a doll. She wrote that her father had returned. She described his posture, his silent, reassuring gaze. The dialogue that had previously existed only in her mind now had a physical anchor. She would speak a question into the quiet air, and then she would sit, her eyes fixed on the doll's button face, and wait for the familiar, internal voice to provide the answer. The doll did not speak, of course, but its presence gave the voice a new authority, a new legitimacy. It was no longer a figment of her imagination. It was a conversation with a member of her household. One companion was not enough to fill the crushing emptiness of the cabin. The silence was a vast ocean, and a single voice was too easily swallowed. Her journal indicates that within a week of creating the first doll, she began to build the rest of her family. Her next creation was the mother. For this, she used the fabric of her own apron, a faded calico printed with small, barely visible blue flowers. This doll was softer, smaller, stuffed with the precious carded wool she had been saving to repair her winter socks. Its eyes were two smaller, pearlescent buttons, taken from the cuff of a blouse. She placed it next to the father doll, creating a silent, parental pair. Then came the brother, fashioned from a rough burlap sack that had once held flour. He was cruder than the others, his limbs stiff and awkward, his eyes two mismatched wooden beads. Her journal entries from this period fracture completely. They cease to be a personal record and become a transcript of a complex and increasingly demanding domestic life. The narration of her own existence is replaced by the reported activities of the cloth figures. Her behavior, as documented in her own hand, shifted from a solitary struggle for survival to a bizarre pantomime of family life. She would stage elaborate, one-sided conversations, her voice a low, constant murmur in the otherwise silent cabin. The journal meticulously records the substance of these interactions. She wrote that the father had advised her on how best to ration the remaining firewood. She noted that the mother had expressed concern about the strange noise the wind made in the chimney. She chronicled arguments between the dolls, disagreements that she would then mediate. One entry details a long, rambling apology she wrote to the brother doll after she had scolded it for, as she claimed, spilling a cup of water that she herself had knocked over. She fed them. Each morning, she would set the wooden bowl on the table and spoon imaginary portions into it for each member of her silent family, describing the taste of the food she wished they had. She cared for them when they were ill, wrapping the dolls in extra scraps of cloth and brewing herbal teas whose steam she would waft over their inert forms. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It had become a stage, and she was the sole, frantic actor, playing all the parts in a drama of her own devising. The dolls were not merely companions. They were a necessary component of her perception of reality. They were her protectors, her confidants, her jury. They were the only proof she had that she still existed. The most disturbing evolution in her behavior, however, concerned the ritual of sleep. The long, dark nights were the most difficult to endure. The wind howled its endless, soul-crushing lament. The cold was a physical presence that seeped through the walls and settled deep in her bones. In the absolute darkness, the barrier between her own thoughts and the perceived voices of the dolls grew dangerously thin. Her journal describes a night of profound terror when she could not distinguish her own fears from the whispers she heard coming from the corner where the dolls Saturday. After that night, she established a new rule. She could not sleep unless she was being watched. Every night, before extinguishing the lamp, she would arrange the dolls on top of the wooden chest at the foot of her cot. She would position them in a neat row, their small, lifeless bodies propped up so that their button eyes were fixed directly upon her. This nightly ritual became an obsession. The placement had to be perfect. The father doll was always in the center, flanked by the mother and the brother. Other, smaller dolls, representing neighbors and friends from a life she could barely remember, were arranged on the outer edges. She would lie on her cot, her body rigid under the thin quilt, and stare back at the unblinking, black jet eyes. Were they protecting her from the loneliness that lurked in the shadows, or were they trapping her within it? The question, as posed by later analysts of her journal, is perhaps a false one. For Eliza, there was no longer a distinction. The dolls and the loneliness were one and the same. They were a prison of her own making, but they were also the only home she had left. She had sewn her companions from the fabric of her own life, and in doing so, had stitched herself into a world from which there was no escape. The comfort they provided was inextricably bound to the horror of her situation. They were a testament to her resilience and a monument to her decay. For several weeks, this fragile, constructed reality held. The days passed in a blur of domestic pantomime, the nights under the silent collective gaze of her cloth family. The world outside the cabin had ceased to exist. Her reality was the warmth of the fire, the texture of the thread, the sound of her own whispering voice, and the unblinking stare of the button eyes. She was the god of this small, self-contained universe, arranging and directing her silent subjects according to a script only she could read. But even a god can lose control of their own creation. The change came without warning, on a morning of particular cold, when the frost had traced intricate fern-like patterns on the inside of the cabin walls. She awoke slowly, her breath pluming in the frigid air. As she did every morning, her first act was to look to the foot of her bed, to the row of watchers on the chest. But this morning, something was wrong. The order was broken. The father doll, the one she always placed precisely in the center of the row, was no longer there. It was on the floor, lying next to the cot, its dark wool body a crumpled heap on the cold wooden planks. She stared at it, her mind a perfect blank. It was an impossibility. She had not touched it. She remembered, with absolute clarity, placing it in its proper position before she had finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep. The cabin was sealed. The door was barred. The single window was covered. No animal could have entered. She was completely and utterly alone. And yet, the doll had moved. A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than any she had known before, pierced through the fog of her delusion. The comfort that she had so carefully manufactured, the companions she had built to keep the terror at bay, had just asserted a will of their own. For the first time, a question entered her mind, a question so monstrous it threatened to shatter the delicate architecture of her sanity. What if the voices she was hearing were not her own? The fear that had always lived outside the cabin walls, the fear of the vast, empty wilderness, had now found a way inside. It had found a new home, in the stitched cloth bodies and the polished button eyes of the silent family she had created. Madness, it is often assumed, is a severing of the connection to reality. But for Eliza Harrow, the events that followed the displacement of the doll suggest a more terrifying possibility. Perhaps madness is not a loss of reality, but a replacement of it with a new one, a world with its own immutable laws, its own inhabitants, and its own terrifying logic. The discovery of the fallen doll was not a momentary lapse in her perception. It was a constitutional crisis in the small, self-contained nation of her mind. The subjects she had created were no longer passive. They were beginning to act. The cabin on Blood Ridge ceased to be a refuge from loneliness and became a theater of the uncanny, a place where the veil between the internal and external world grew catastrophically thin. Her journal, which had already transformed from a personal diary into a record of a fictional domestic life, now mutated again. It became a logbook of supernatural phenomena, a desperate attempt to document a reality that was slipping further and further from her control. The entries are marked by a new tone, a creeping, ontological dread. After the incident with the fallen doll, she writes that she spent the entire day in a state of hypervigilance, her eyes flitting constantly between the silent figures propped on the chest and the barred door of the cabin. She describes the silence in the room as having changed. It was no longer empty. It was charged, expectant. She felt, she wrote, like an intruder in her own home. The dolls, which had once been a comforting audience for her solitary monologue, now felt like a silent, judgmental tribunal. Their button eyes seemed to follow her as she moved about the small space, their stillness no longer passive, but predatory. The true horror began, as it so often does, in the deep of the night. Sleep, which had once been a brief respite, became a terrifying ordeal from which she fought to stay away. She writes of being jolted awake by sounds that had no source, a faint, dry whispering, like the rustle of dried leaves, but coming from within the cabin. At first, she dismissed it as the sound of mice in the walls or the wind playing tricks with the chimney. But the sound grew more distinct, more articulate. It was, she became convinced, the sound of voices, not the loud, clear internal voice of her father that she had grown accustomed to, but something else. A multitude of faint, sibilant whispers, overlapping and indistinct, too quiet to make out any individual words, yet unmistakably conversational in their cadence, and they were not in her head. They were in the room with her. She would lie paralyzed on her cot, the thin quilt pulled up to her chin, her eyes wide in the impenetrable darkness, and listen. The whispering would seem to come from the foot of the bed, from the very spot where the dolls sat on their nightly vigil. It sounded, she wrote in one terrifyingly lucid passage, like her own thoughts being spoken back to her, but in a voice that was not her own. The psychological strain of this nightly assault is evident in the very fabric of her writing. Her once elegant script, which had already shown signs of fragmentation, now began to splinter entirely. The pages of the journal become a battleground for multiple identities. Sections are written in her familiar, careful hand, documenting the strange occurrences with a detached, almost scientific horror. But these passages are frequently interrupted by another style of writing altogether. A cramped, spidery script, angled sharply to the left, would scrawl messages in the margins or even between the lines of her own text. These interpolated messages were accusatory and cruel. Where Eliza would write of her fear, the other hand would mock her, calling her weak. Where she would express hope for the spring, the other hand would scrawl a single, chilling word, never. It was as if a hostile entity had taken up residence not only in her cabin, but in the pages of her own private record. Forensic analysis conducted in the 20th century on the surviving pages would confirm that the ink and penmanship of these alternating styles, while superficially different, likely originated from the same hand, a classic presentation of a dissociative state. But for Eliza, trapped in the eye of her own psychological storm, this was not a symptom of a fractured mind. It was proof of a haunting. The dolls were no longer just moving when she slept. Their positions would change during the day. She would turn her back for a moment to stir the fire, and when she looked again, two of the dolls would be angled toward each other, as if in silent conversation. The mother doll once appeared on the table, seated on the stool, a position Eliza was certain she had not placed it in. These small, inexplicable translocations were a form of psychological torture, a constant, low-level assault on her sense of reality. Was she moving them herself, in a state of fugue, and then forgetting, or were they truly acting of their own accord? The ambiguity was the most terrifying part. It created an environment of profound and inescapable paranoia. Every object in the cabin, every shadow, every creak of the logs settling, became a potential threat. The world she had so carefully constructed to keep her sane was now actively working to unmake her. The escalating weirdness was not limited to the visual and auditory. Her other senses began to betray her as well. She writes of a strange, persistent cold spot in the cabin, a column of frigid air near the hearth that never seemed to dissipate, no matter how high she built the fire. She describes the phantom scent of wet wool and damp earth, even on the driest days. The atmosphere within the cabin grew thick and oppressive, heavy with a sense of ancient, unseen life. The mountain, which had been a passive backdrop to her suffering, now seemed to be an active participant, its elemental forces focused on this one small, isolated point of human consciousness. The snow piled up in drifts against the door, sealing her in more completely than any lock. The wind, howling down the chimney, seemed to shape itself into words, fragments of old lullabies her mother used to sing, twisted into something mournful and macabre. Was she haunted by the ghosts of her solitude, or had her profound isolation made her a beacon for something that had always inhabited Blood Ridge, something old and hungry that fed on loneliness? The climax of this period of intense psychological collapse is recorded in an entry that is nearly illegible, the words crammed together, the ink smudged and blotted, as if the hand that wrote it was trembling violently. It is the final entry in which her own primary personality seems to be in control. She describes waking in the middle of the night, not to the sound of whispering, but to a profound and absolute silence. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, pulsing red glow across the room. She felt a weight on her chest, a physical pressure that made it difficult to breathe. When her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw it. The father doll was sitting on her, its small, inert body resting on her sternum, its button eyes inches from her face. In the faint, demonic light of the embers, they did not look like buttons. They looked like two small, dark pits, tunnels, leading into an absolute and unending darkness. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the thick log walls, and thrashed, sending the doll flying across the room where it landed with a soft, dull thud. The entry ends there, a single, spidery sentence that trails off as if the writer was violently interrupted. It reads, "It was not the doll's weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. It was the hand inside it, pressing down." After that night, the journal falls silent for several weeks. When the writing resumes, it is in a new, unified voice. The cramped secondary handwriting is gone, but so is Eliza's original, lucid script. What remains is a third voice, one that is calm, detached, and utterly alien. It is a collective voice. The entries no longer use the pronoun I, they use we. We watched the snow fall today. We decided the fire was too low. The writing describes the daily routines of the cabin not from the perspective of a lone woman, but from the perspective of a group, a family. Eliza Harrow, the individual, the thinking, feeling, fearing self, had been entirely submerged. Her consciousness had been subsumed by the very entities she had created to save it. She had become one of them. The replacement of her reality was complete. The final entry in the journal, written on a day when the first signs of the spring thaw must have been appearing, when the light through the oiled hide of the window would have held a new and hopeful strength, is the most chilling of all. It is written in a firm, steady hand, the script of someone who is no longer in distress, but has arrived at a place of final, settled purpose. The sentence is short, declarative, and pregnant with a terrible unspoken finality. It says, simply, "They do not need me anymore." And with those words, the written record of Eliza Harrow's life and her sanity comes to an end. The journal falls silent, and centuries of mountain quiet descend to cover the tracks of what happened next. Some stories do not have a clean ending. They do not resolve. Instead, they lie dormant, like seeds buried in the frozen earth, waiting for the right conditions to be discovered and to grow again in the minds of a new generation. The silence that fell over Eliza Harrow's journal was absolute, a void of information that lasted for nearly 2 centuries. The search party in 1717, finding the cabin empty save for the strange tableau of the dolls, could only speculate on the fate of the young woman. They reported her and her father as lost to the wilderness, another grim tally in the unforgiving calculus of settlement. The cabin, tucked away in its hidden fold of Blood Ridge, was gradually reclaimed by the forest. Saplings grew into trees, their roots slowly dislodging the foundation stones. The roof of sod collapsed inward, and a thick blanket of leaves and soil accumulated, burying the small structure until it was little more than a subtle, unnatural mound in the landscape. The story of the girl of Blood Ridge faded from living memory, becoming a ghost story, a piece of local folklore whispered around winter fires, its factual origins lost to the blurring effects of time. It was not until the early years of the 20th century that the mountain was forced to give up its secret. The rediscovery was, like the initial finding, an accident. In 1903, a team of surveyors was commissioned by a timber company to create the first truly comprehensive topographical map of the region. They were methodical, scientific men, their tools theodolites and measuring chains, their purpose to translate the wild, chaotic landscape into a neat grid of lines and numbers. For weeks, they battled the unforgiving terrain, cutting sight lines through dense undergrowth, their progress slow and arduous. One afternoon, while working their way up a particularly steep and unpromising slope, one of the younger members of the team, a man named Miller, lost his footing on a patch of slick, moss-covered rock. He slid a dozen feet down the incline, his fall broken by a dense thicket of rhododendron. As his colleagues helped him to his feet, shaken but unharmed, Miller noticed something odd. The ground beneath the thicket where he had landed felt strangely hollow. Brushing aside the thick, leathery leaves, he saw the unmistakable, symmetrical lines of rotted timber beams protruding from the earth. They had stumbled upon the sunken remains of a roof, curiosity overpowering their professional obligations. The team spent the rest of the afternoon excavating the site with their hand tools. They cleared away the accumulated soil and debris, slowly revealing the outline of a small, single-room log structure. The upper logs had long since rotted away, but the lower portions, protected by the earth, were remarkably preserved, the wood hardened and darkened by time. They found the collapsed remains of the fieldstone chimney, and then the doorway. The space within was not a hollow cavity, as they had expected, but a sealed chamber, filled with the tightly packed, compressed debris of the collapsed roof and centuries of forest decay. It was like opening a time capsule. The air that was released as they breached the interior was heavy and musty, thick with the scent of loam, rotted wood, and something else, a faint, dry, almost floral aroma, the ghost of the herbs Eliza had so carefully bundled. Working with a newfound reverence, they carefully cleared the interior space. The environment within had been anaerobic, low in oxygen, which had resulted in a state of preservation that was nothing short of miraculous. As they removed the last of the soil and rotted timber, a scene of profound and unsettling stillness was revealed, illuminated by the dusty shafts of late afternoon sunlight filtering through the trees. The major wooden furniture, the cot frame, the table, the stool, were all present, their forms softened and distorted by decay, but still recognizable. The iron pot still hung in the collapsed hearth, but it was the tableau at the center of the room that caused the men to fall silent, their shovels held motionless in their hands. There, seated on the remains of a simple chair that had crumbled into a pile of wooden splinters, was a human skeleton. It was in a seated, upright posture, a position it could only have maintained because it was held in place by the packed earth that had surrounded it for nearly 2 centuries. The bones were a dark, antique brown, the color of stained oak. It was the skeleton of a woman, small of frame, the details of the pelvic girdle, and the skull, confirming her sex to the team's physician, who examined the remains later. In her lap, resting against the skeletal thighs, was a small, desiccated leather-bound book, its pages fused into a solid, impenetrable block by moisture and time. But it was the detail of the hands that was the most haunting. The delicate bones of the right hand were curled around a rusted iron needle, its tip still holding a blackened, thread-like filament of preserved sinew, and arranged in a semicircle on the floor around the chair, just as the first search party had found them, were the dolls. They were in a state of near-perfect preservation, the dry, oxygen-deprived conditions having protected them from the ravages of time. Their cloth bodies were stiff and brittle, their colors faded to a uniform, dusty gray, but they were entirely intact. Their button eyes, dark and polished, stared up at the living men who had disturbed their long vigil, their expressions as blank and inscrutable as they had been on the day they were sewn. The surveyors, rough men accustomed to the practicalities of their trade, were deeply unnerved. The scene felt sacred, a private ritual interrupted. It was not a gravesite, it was a shrine. The woman had not simply died in her chair. It appeared she had been working, sewing perhaps, up to the very last moment, surrounded by her silent, watchful family. The discovery caused a minor sensation. The story was picked up by newspapers in the state capital, and the remains, along with the artifacts from the cabin, were transported to the state university for study. The case was assigned to a Dr. William Kettering, a rising star in the nascent field of anthropology, a man with a particular interest in the folklore and material culture of the isolated Appalachian communities. For Kettering, the Blood Ridge cabin was a treasure trove, a perfectly sealed archaeological site that offered an unprecedented glimpse into the psychological effects of extreme isolation. He oversaw the painstaking process of separating and preserving the pages of the journal, a task that took months of delicate work. As he and his team slowly deciphered Eliza Harrow's spidery script, the full, tragic arc of her story was revealed for the first time. Kettering's monograph on the subject, published in 1907 and titled The Blood Ridge Case, a study in the pathology of solitude, became a foundational text in the field. In his writing, Kettering adopted a cool, clinical, and forensic tone. He analyzed the journal entries, the shifting handwriting, the construction of the dolls, not as a supernatural event, but as a textbook case of psychological breakdown. He pathologized Eliza's experience, labeling her behavior as a manifestation of complex hallucinations brought on by profound sensory deprivation and malnutrition. The dolls, he argued, were transitional objects, physical manifestations of a constructed parasocial reality, a desperate attempt by a fracturing ego to maintain a semblance of social connection. He posited that she had likely succumbed to starvation or exposure during that final winter, dying peacefully in her chair, her mind having long since retreated into the world she had created. The final journal entry, "They do not need me anymore," he interpreted as the moment her own sense of self was completely extinguished. Her identity fully merged with the collective he called her cloth-bound society. Was Eliza's madness hers alone, a tragic but understandable consequence of her circumstances, or was it something more? Was it possible that the mountain itself, the profound and ancient loneliness of Blood Ridge, had played an active role, that it had a way of keeping company with those who stayed too long in its embrace? Kettering's analysis, while comprehensive, contained a small, almost dismissive footnote that, in retrospect, seems like a piece of profound and unintentional foreshadowing. Of all the artifacts recovered from the cabin, he had become particularly fascinated by the first doll Eliza had made, the one fashioned from her father's dark wool shirt. He described its construction in minute detail, noting its unusual weight and the unnerving, symmetrical placement of its black jet button eyes. He found its presence so compelling that, after his official study was complete, he did not place it in the university museum with the other artifacts. Instead, with the informal permission of the university chancellor, he took the doll back to his office. He kept it on the corner of his large oak desk, where it sat amidst his books and papers, a silent, woolen memento of the most fascinating case of his career. He wrote in a letter to a colleague that he found its presence calming, a reminder of the deep and powerful mysteries of the human mind. He had solved the puzzle of Eliza Harrow, he believed. The case file was closed. But what Dr. Kettering failed to understand was that some stories are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be inherited. The curse of loneliness, born in the suffocating silence of that cabin, had simply been dormant. And now, it had found a new listener. Isolation, it would seem, is not a condition but a contagion. It is a parasitic entity that can lie dormant for decades, sealed within an object, a story, a memory. Its transmission requires a specific medium, a susceptible human mind, a quiet room, and a long, lonely night. The story of Eliza Harrow did not end with the discovery of her bones or the academic dissection of her journal. The closing of the official case file was merely a pause, a caesura in a story that was far from over. The vessel of the contagion, the small doll fashioned from a father's woolen shirt, was simply moved from one quiet room to another, waiting patiently for a new host. Dr. William Kettering, the man who had so confidently diagnosed Eliza's madness, kept the doll on his desk for the remainder of his career. He treated it as a scientific curiosity, a totem of his most famous case. He would use it as a teaching aid, gesturing with it during lectures on psychopathology, its dark button eyes staring blankly at generations of students. Yet, those who knew him in his later years remarked on a subtle change in his demeanor. The once gregarious and confident academic became increasingly withdrawn, prone to long periods of silence. His colleagues attributed it to the pressures of his work, the inevitable melancholy of a life spent studying the darker aspects of the human condition. After his retirement, he lived as a recluse. Upon his death in 1938, his estate bequeathed his extensive collection of artifacts and papers to the University Museum, and among them, itemized on a yellowed ledger as Appalachian Folk Effigy, circa 1717, was the doll from Blood Ridge. For decades, the doll remained in the museum's climate-controlled storage, a forgotten artifact among thousands. It lay in a long, shallow cardboard box, surrounded by acid-free tissue paper, its file noting its provenance and Kettering's diagnosis. It was a solved mystery, a closed case, and therefore of little interest. It was not until the museum underwent a major renovation in the 1970s, with a new wing dedicated to regional history and folklore, that the doll was brought out of the darkness. A young, ambitious curator, a man whose primary field of study was the material culture of early colonial settlements, stumbled upon its file. Intrigued by the lurid details of the Blood Ridge case, he requisitioned the artifact for a new exhibit he was designing, an exhibit on the psychological hardships of the frontier. He believed the doll would be a powerful centerpiece, a tangible link to a dark and fascinating chapter of local history. The curator was a man of his time, a scholar who believed in rational explanations, in the power of context and interpretation to demystify the past. He saw the doll not as a haunted object, but as a profound and tragic piece of folk art, a testament to the corrosive effects of human loneliness. He designed a special display for it. A small, climate-controlled glass vitrine was constructed, set into a wall and illuminated by a single, low-wattage spotlight. Inside, the doll was mounted on a simple, unobtrusive stand, its woolen body held upright, its button eyes gazing into the sterile, quiet space of the gallery. Next to the case, a placard was mounted, its text drafted by the curator himself. It told a condensed, clinical version of Eliza's story, citing Kettering's original analysis. The exhibit was a success, a point of dark fascination for museum visitors. But for the staff who worked in the gallery day after day, the doll's presence began to take on a different character. The phenomena were small, subtle, and easily dismissed. They began with a feeling. Security guards patrolling the gallery at night reported an overwhelming sense of being watched, a feeling that was localized to the area immediately surrounding the Blood Ridge exhibit. They would find themselves unconsciously avoiding that corner of the room during their rounds. Cleaning crews complained of a persistent, inexplicable cold spot in front of the doll's vitrine, a pocket of air that remained stubbornly chilled, even on the warmest days. The gallery's sophisticated climate control systems were checked and found to be in perfect working order. More tangibly, paperwork related to the doll's acquisition and provenance would go missing from the museum's archives, only to reappear days later in places no one would think to look. These were minor anomalies, the kind of mundane institutional quirks that could be explained away by human error, drafts, and overactive imaginations. But they were consistent, and they all revolved around the small, silent figure in the glass case. The curator, a man who prided himself on his skepticism, initially dismissed the staff's quiet complaints as superstitious nonsense. He had spent his entire professional life stripping the magical thinking from the past, exposing it to the harsh, rational light of historical inquiry. He refused to entertain the notion that an inanimate object could exert any influence on its surroundings. Yet, he found himself drawn to the exhibit, more so than to any other in the museum. He would often end his day by standing before the vitrine, studying the doll's crude construction. He admired the tightness of the stitches, the strange, puckered texture around the button eyes. He saw in it not a source of dread, but a symbol of a desperate, creative act. He was not afraid of it. He was fascinated by it. His fascination, however, began to bleed into his life outside the museum's walls. It started with his research. He found himself spending his evenings in the archives, rereading Kettering's original monograph, and then the fragile, digitized copies of Eliza Harrow's journal itself. He read the words over and over, until he had memorized their sad, spiraling cadence. Then came the dreams. They were not nightmares, not at first. They were intensely vivid, atmospheric dreams that transported him to a place he had never been. He would find himself standing in a small, dark room, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs. He could hear the relentless, howling song of the wind outside, and feel a cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. In the dream, he was not himself. He was a passive observer, watching a young woman with his own eyes. He saw her hands, chapped and raw, as she methodically tore strips from a calico apron. He heard the whisper of a needle passing through coarse wool. He watched her set a place at an empty table. He never saw her face, but he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he was watching Eliza Harrow. The dreams were not frightening. They were deeply, profoundly melancholic. He would wake from them with a sense of loss so acute it felt like a physical ache in his chest. Over time, the dreams grew more intense, more immersive. He began to hear her voice. It was not a spoken voice, but a stream of thoughts, a desperate, internal monologue that narrated her small, repetitive actions. He heard her hope, and then he heard her fear. He experienced her crushing loneliness not as a concept, but as a direct, sensory input. The line between his own consciousness and the historical subject he was studying began to blur. He would find himself thinking her thoughts during the day, a fragment of her journal echoing in his mind as he sat in a meeting or drove his car. The doll in the vitrine no longer seemed like a mere artifact. It felt like a conduit, a direct line to the consciousness that had created it. His academic interest curdled into a quiet, all-consuming obsession. He grew withdrawn, just as Kettering had. His colleagues noted his pallor, his distraction. He stopped publishing, his own research grinding to a halt, replaced by his endless, circular study of the Bloodridge case. The story closes on a cold, rainy night in late autumn, decades after the exhibit first opened. The curator, now a gaunt, gray-haired man approaching retirement, was working late in the archives, a privilege of his senior position. The museum was empty, the galleries dark, the only sounds the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the main hall and the drumming of the rain against the tall, arched windows. He was alone, surrounded by the carefully catalogued ghosts of the past. On his desk, under the green-shaded glow of a reading lamp, was a high-resolution photograph of the final page of Eliza Harrow's journal. The museum was preparing a small publication to mark the bicentennial of the state's founding, and he had been tasked with writing a short essay on the Bloodridge case. He stared at the final, steady sentence, the words he now knew by heart. He did something he had never done before. He spoke the words aloud, his voice a low murmur in the vast, silent room. He read, "They do not need me anymore." He said it to the empty archives, to the rows of sleeping artifacts, to the ghost of the woman whose life had consumed his own. He paused, the words hanging in the dusty air, and in the profound silence that followed, he heard something. It was a sound so faint it was almost imperceptible, a dry, whispering rustle, like the sound of a needle being pulled through old cloth. It was impossible to say where it came from. It could have been the settling of the old building, the hiss of the radiator, a trick of the acoustics in the high-ceilinged room. But to the curator, who had spent half his life immersed in this one story, the sound was unmistakable. It was a reply, and it had not come from the room around him. It had come from within his own mind, a thought that was not his, a faint, sibilant whisper that said, "Now we need you." Did Eliza Harrow ever truly leave Bloodridge? Or did Bloodridge, that profound and patient state of isolation, simply change its form, waiting for someone to open the file and listen to its story once more? The curator sat motionless for a long time as the rain lashed against the windows. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for the cuff of his own tweed jacket, his fingers pinching the fabric. He opened the top drawer of his desk and took out a small, mother-of-pearl handled pocket knife. He opened the blade and with a steady hand began to carefully, precisely, cut away a small, rectangular piece of the sleeve. The case file on Eliza Harrow is now closed. Our work here in these forgotten spaces is only possible because you are present to bear witness. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to ensure you stand with us when the next file is opened, and leave your thoughts on the echoes you have heard tonight in the comments below.